What does life hold for philosophy majors? I decided to find out. Welcome to Life After Philosophy. I'm Christopher Anadale. Welcome to Life After Philosophy. My guest today is Matthew Shoemaker. He is a 2012 graduate of Mount St. Mary's University with a Master of Arts in Philosophical Studies degree. He went on to study nuclear war strategy at King's College London, where he is ABD in a PhD program. He earned a certificate in strategic defense strategy from the US Army War College in 2020 and is an intelligence officer in the US Naval Reserve. He currently serves as a military and national security commentator for Fox News, Newsmax, and other broadcasters. Matthew, welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be here, Professor. Thanks very much for having me on.
Tell me something about the path that's taken you from a master's degree in philosophy 12 years ago to the position you're in right now in naval intelligence, nuclear war strategy. It sounds like you've had quite a career in a direction that's not typically taken by most students of philosophy or former seminarians.
Absolutely, yeah. And as you alluded to, yeah, actually, when I was in the MAPS program at the Mount, I was a seminarian for the Archdiocese of Washington, D.C. But through the intense discernment process that the Catholic Church has, I discovered that that wasn't really what God was calling me to do. And the reason my life probably took the track that you mentioned was I come from a very long military family. I've got members of my family who've served in the armed forces in the United States, going back virtually every generation back to the American Revolution. So it's always been kind of in my blood. Thankfully, I don't have a Lieutenant Dan situation from Forrest Gump going on. Only one of my relatives, I think, died in combat. So thankfully, I didn't have that to live up to. But no, that's kind of why I decided to go into the military route. I actually at one point was a intelligence officer for the Defense Intelligence Agency as well before I put on the uniform for the Navy. But I've always been interested in the study of warfare and the philosophy behind it of it when it comes down to it, it's more about human nature than anything. I did my master's thesis for MAPS on philosophical anthropology more than anything. And so it's what are the motivating factors, for why people would want to, number one, kill each other, and number two, when it comes to nuclear war strategy, kill each other so much that you're willing to destroy, entire civilizations, if not the world, over it. So that's it. It certainly is a very odd track, if you will, but that's the path that God put out for me.
It's remarkable. Yeah, it's interesting to see how, certainly military service runs in many families. And you're now in a kind of a desk job type thing with military service, intelligence officer and national security commentator. What's let me ask you this, speaking just purely as a classroom professor and somebody who doesn't deal with the doings of the mighty, we might say. Um, where do you approach the ethics of something like nuclear war strategy? I mean, some people might say there's just an issue of scale and destructiveness here, where the ethical questions ought to be, quite easy, as in, don't press that button. What kind of issues come up that you find are worthy of a kind of serious philosophical consideration?
Sure. So I think one of the things that I've learned over the process of both from an academic perspective of looking at nuclear war and then actually working with Strategic Command when I was part of DIA, for example, and Strategic Command deals almost exclusively with the use of our ICBMs and nuclear weapons. So that's the more practical side of things. One thing that I learned along the way is that there is a lot of, for understandable reasons, propaganda around nuclear weapons, right? And by that I mean we in the United States have for the past 50 years, whenever the discussion of it comes up, right, wrong, or indifferent, it always sort of tends to it's end of the world sort of situation. And many ways, I think actually from an ethical perspective, that's a better way of looking at it because it prevents you from actually, as you mentioned, pushing the button. And for any of your listeners who are, pop culture enthusiasts or anything like that, the new TV show Fallout on, I think it's Amazon Prime or so. If you haven't seen that, it actually does a decent job in terms of uh, kind of alluding to what society might look like if usage of nuclear weapons sort of becomes not only acceptable but relatively normalized, and the very severe ethical problems that come from something like that. But to take it back a step to what you initially asked about what the actual ethical problems are, I think we get an extra wrinkle in there as well nowadays with Pope Francis and how he had mentioned how just war theory may not be an acceptable way of looking at ethical forms of usage of violence, for example. So that certainly adds an extra wrinkle to how to evaluate these sorts of things. I'll say from a practical standpoint, the discussions I had with regards to things like strategic command and the wargaming situations that we came out with, oftentimes they tended to deal with the tactical use of nuclear weapons. And by tactical, I mean when it is there are generally speaking two different types of nuclear weapons. There's a strategic kind, the ones that destroy cities, if you will, and there are the tactical kind, the smaller ones that are in theory supposed to be used against, like a brigade or a company or what, some sort of military unit. You're supposed to just want to destroy them all with, one weapon.
Battlefield nukes,
Battlefield nuke.
something out of a Tom Clancy novel. Yeah.
Correct, correct. Now, of course, you can use a battlefield nuke in a city. It's not going to destroy the city, but you're using a tactical nuke for strategic purposes. So from a practical standpoint, most of the discussions that they gamed out for, that they needed to train for, were all based off of tactical usage of them against military units. So that's that element of it. I think with regards to the ethical standpoint of that, I would say if there is going to be an ethical use of nuclear weapons, that probably would be the least bad option of using a military weapon against a military unit, sort of thing. So is there going to be are there going to be casualties? Are there going to be innocents that go along with it? Very possibly. Very possibly. Unfortunately, that's the situation with all warfare, and that's why just war theory was developed more than anything to try and limit that. But then, of course, we get the extra wrinkle of whether or not just war theory is up to snuff or still valid. Is that's something that I have not had to contend with, thankfully, in my life at this point.
Is it possible to do proportionality calculations with small yield weapons or relatively clean weapons with that do maybe say a sort of a limited amount of damage to the permanent damage to the environment?
So that is a like most things moral philosophy related, it is a complicated question because as you just alluded to, you have to take into account environmental factors, you have to take into account the human factor, of course, and others. There, I would say that there potentially are situations where there could be an ethical use of that. So, and the reason I say that with a heavy amount of reservation is a lot of nuclear weapons are what are called variable yield nuclear weapons, which means you can actually dial up what the yield is to a certain amount, or you can dial it down. It's an interesting sort of thing. And so, for example, with regards to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Russia, as part of their strategic nuclear policies, they set out what they call red lines of if this event happens, then these are the circumstances under which we're going to use nuclear weapons. One of them being if you directly attack Russian soil, it gives them, the Russians, according to them, the right to respond with nuclear weapons. Now, let's add some extra problems in there with Russia claims a number of different provinces in Ukraine as part of Russia. Ukraine claims it as part of theirs, but from the Russian perspective, any time that the Ukrainians attack those provinces, that is a direct attack on Russian soil. So from that theory, the Russians have the ability to respond. But anyways, the reason I say this is because there was some discussion about a year ago or so that because that's when Russia had just formally claimed those provinces as their own, that Russia might respond with nuclear weapons. But what they'll do is instead of using like a 20-ton nuclear bomb, they'll dial it down to maybe a quarter of a kiloton sort of thing, to the point where it's so low that it raises the question. You're not exactly sure if it was a nuke that went off or if it was just a really strong conventional bomb. And the reason why that becomes important is because by that point you need to send your own planes to actually collect the air samples to see if there are radioactive material in the air to determine if it was actually a nuclear bomb. In which case, if it determines to be a nuclear bomb, number one, the Russians have already done it, and it's been a number of days since they did it. So the time that it's happened is it's no longer as emotionally charged, if you will, because a number of days have gone by since it occurred. But at the same time, though, too, then it breaks that threshold that we talked about earlier of now someone has used nuclear weapons in battle. It's really low, but they used it. So it becomes very muddy and very dark quickly. Now, having said all this, there's actually a very interesting researcher by the name of Dr. Herman Kahn. He died, gosh, in the 1980s or so. But he was the gentleman who essentially drew up American nuclear war policy for, gosh, 30, 40 years or so, starting in the 1950s until his death. And actually, in many ways, it's still, to a certain extent, part of the United States' nuclear strategy and nuclear doctrine. And the reason I bring him up, he has a wonderful book called On Thermonuclear Warfare, or On Thermonuclear War, in which he does kind of remove a lot of the propaganda that surrounds nuclear warfare, and he goes into number crunching in terms of if this yield goes off, a uh, uh, in a pasture or something like that, how much of that land is actually going to be irradiated? To what extent is that land going to be irradiated? Can you still use it for certain crops? And according to him, at least, the first probably layer or inch or two of soil is going to be irradiated to the point where you don't want to really use it. But he's like, you can actually probably plant things like potatoes because they grow a lot deeper, and those will be fine, and you can actually pull those right up and eat them, not have any issues. So it's a very interesting way of looking at things, because our propaganda always is nuclear warfare is going to destroy everything. We're all going to die. We're all going to starve. It's like, well, actually, there are mitigating factors that we could still survive. And for example, not to go off on a tangent or anything like that, but Herman Kahn actually had this interesting point. He's like, you know what? Our cattle industry might be absolutely destroyed in the process, but down in Argentina and Brazil, it's South America. No one really wants to nuke there. No one really cares. Their cattle industry is going to be doing pretty well. So we'll just import their cattle. We'll send our potatoes down to them to sell to them, and the economics will continue. So it's a very interesting way of looking at some of the worst things that could possibly befall humanity, and how they, in all likelihood, would be able to survive. Not happily, but still nonetheless be able to survive in a somewhat civilized fashion.
And this sounds all very surprising to me, of course, as someone as a kid who grew up in the '80s and sort of drank very deeply of a great deal of the pop culture talk about the nuclear threat in the late years of the Cold War, which is something strange to me now, of course, having to talk to my own children, who all of whom were born, more than a decade after the Berlin Wall fell, and the Cold War is like World War II for them, or even World War I. It's a very distant memory, but the nuclear threat was quite real, certainly for us as school children back in the day. And I realize I've spent a huge amount of time. I went right to the most controversial word in your whole bio, which was nuclear war. And I got you talking on that, but I'm sure there are plenty other things from your life as an intelligence officer, and sort of thinking as the difference that philosophy made in your different movement through the different careers and career stages that you've had. What more could we talk about that doesn't involve the sort of perspective end of the world?
Let's see. Well, as you and I had mentioned off camera, I actually most recently, as of a couple months ago, came off of running for Congress in North Carolina of all places. So yeah, I ran for a House seat to be in Washington D.C. Unfortunately, I didn't make it out of the primary. But no, actually, the fun thing was, of course, on the campaign trail, people wanted to talk about, my experience as an intelligence officer, because everyone thinks it's like, oh, James Bond sort of stuff, and it's like, not really, but I do see some pretty cool stuff every now and then. But no, the philosophy actually did come up more often than I expected along the way. And that's actually, in all honesty, happened virtually in every job that I've had since I graduated from the MAPS program 12 years ago or so now. I would always play games, if you will, with my colleagues, nice philosophy games that I would tease them with, and I would usually play two of them. Usually one was the Ship of Theseus game, and then the Trolley Dilemma as well. And I'd just ask them questions, and I would take the Socratic method more than anything, but I would do it in such a disarming and non-offensive way, just to try and get them to play along. It was a lot of fun, to be honest. I really enjoyed it, seeing some of the responses. And, whatever the response would be, it would tell me a little bit something about their own personalities, and it would be a way for us to connect and have some fun. But then I would also take it a step further, especially with the trolley dilemma, and try and turn it to what the practical real world applications of philosophy can be if we want it to be. And so for the trolley dilemma, for example, whatever they say in terms of whether they would flip the switch and, kill that one person, or, or if they would allow the 10 people to die, didn't matter. The point I was trying to get to them was, there are some instances in life where uh, only a bad result is going to happen. There's some things that you can't avoid. And then I related that to things like self-driving cars. Sometimes for a self-driving car, there's only going to be a bad option for that thing to take. A collision is inevitable. What is the least bad option for it to choose? And then on top of it, there are going to be engineers that have to program those cars to choose the least bad option. So those engineers have to have some sort of philosophical background, or whoever it is making the decision about what they want that ethics system to be is going to have to be there for it. I mean, that's the entire premise of the movie I, Robot with Will Smith from years ago. Even though it wasn't that great of a movie, it still was. The entire premise was the ethical system that those robots were programmed with was not a appropriate ethical system from his perspective. And that's really the value that philosophy has given to me, of being able to show people the real world applications of philosophy, and not just have to be beholden. Controlled is a little bit of a strong term, but at the mercy of just what pop culture is telling us we should fall into. It's the ability to give pause and say, is that really true, or what's deeper, what's going on here, sort of thing. So that's really the value that philosophy has done for me. It's really been quite wonderful, more than anything. If I had to sum it up in one phrase, it's really been absolutely wonderful.
Let me press you a little bit on the trolley problem question, because one of the things that comes up in thinking about the trolley problem, it's very useful in forcing to the surface whatever people's intuitions are about the right way of making a choice. It brings to the foreground the sacrifices, the loss involved with making a choice. Of course, it is a forced choice. It's the very nature of the trolley problem to be, do you flip the switch or not? There's a binary outcome. It's very, and that works well with decision theory. It's easy to think of it through a series of nodes and iterated prisoner games, etc. But one criticism of it might be that it does presume an awful lot in terms of the framework. That is, one of the things that's invisible to the person who's answering the trolley problem are the assumptions that the trolley problem is sort of loading into the entire decision matrix that they're using to decide between these things. So it leaves sort of off the table, at least, the sort of invisible possibility of a systematic critique. Is that something that's come up in your thinking, or even in your work, in a general way?
In terms of when I would interact with other people for it, I would say that they would usually it would go a couple different ways. Usually, one of the more common ways was they would first try to build in some extra steps in there to try to get them out of having to make a binary choice. And when I would push them off and say, no, this is your choice, what do you do? And as you mentioned, you force that choice on them. Usually, then they'll acquiesce, and then they'll make the decision, and then they'll give their reasoning for why they chose it. And I usually tell them, I'm like, there really is no right or wrong answer here. I'm like, I have my opinion in terms of what is the better ethical model to go through with this. And we have a discussion afterwards in terms of all that sort of stuff, in terms of why they chose this, why I think why, what my decision is, and that kind of thing. In terms of bringing it into my everyday work, I'm not gonna lie, it really doesn't, outside of just having fun conversations with people, it doesn't usually come up with in terms of everyday work sort of thing. But more than anything, I would say that it's the reason I do it, though, more so than anything, is that it really does shed light on how someone thinks, and especially for people who have never really thought about situations like that before, and to get them to thinking, number one, life or death situation, number two, what their um, responsibility is with regards to that, um, and then their rationale behind it. And if it's the first time that they're really doing that, I mean, you could see the wheels turning behind their eyes, and how they've usually, more often than not, I don't think I've had too many people who've had bad experiences, having that interaction with them. Most people actually really enjoyed doing that with me. They found it fun, they found it stimulating, they found it, in a certain sense, nourishing, intellectually speaking, to be able to do that. And maybe it's the way that I'm presenting it. I usually present it in the way I'm doing it right now. It's fun, it's happy-go-lucky, there's no pressure. It's just, I'm just having fun here, type thing. In which case, they go away thinking that it was a really fun experience, and it really kind of gives them a different perspective, that that a lot of people, they just fall into the mechanics of everyday life. They go to their job, they're there to produce a widget, they're there to produce a product. They go home, they hang out with their spouse, their kids, and then they do it all over again, sort of thing. So to get them out of that shell, and to think deeper, to be a little bit more of a holistic human being, they seem to really kind of enjoy that, even if it's just a 5-minute trolley dilemma discussion. It's weird.
It does seem like it's a very good on-ramp, certainly for a deeper reflection and discussion, including maybe for people who can stick with it that long, reflecting on the very nature of the forced choice scenario in the trolley problem, and the kind of attitude towards the ethical life and ethical decision making that it presumes. Let me back up a moment. You mentioned when you talk about intelligence work to people on the campaign trail, they assume it's a kind of a James Bond thing, or if not Bond, then M or Q or the guy in the chair,
Jason Bourne or some,
back at
yeah, any of
headquarters.
those.
Right. Are there any fiction authors? I think of Graham Greene myself, but of others who you think kind of get the nature of intelligence work right, or mostly right, in a fictional universe? Perhaps there's no good answer to that question, but
That
what do
is
you
a
think?
great question. That is a great question. I'm gonna give a little bit of a cop out and say, how do I put this? I don't read too much fictionalized intelligence work, simply because I've lived it for so long. It's like going to work, and then coming home, and then but you haven't really left because you're still doing work related sort of stuff. So I usually
But
try to keep my
Busman's holiday, I should have
yeah,
expected that. Yeah.
yeah. I kind of just want to take a break from that when I'm off the clock, if you will. So I don't read too many fictionalized stuff with regards to that. So I can't really give you a good answer. I will say, though, that at least from the more Hollywood-esque sort of stuff, is that James Bond would have been killed, 8 ways to Sunday, if he did all the stuff that he did. I will say that for a intelligence agent, which is what James Bond would be. He wouldn't be an intelligence officer. There is a distinction. An intelligence agent, who is someone who's like collecting information. They're working their own network of people who are, they're collecting information against their own country, and spying for them, all that sort of stuff. The amount of paperwork that goes into that is ridiculous. I mean, when they plan out when they're going to, hand off, information or something like that, the amount of paperwork you have to go and say, this is where I'm going to go, this is how I'm going to get there. It's going to take me 4 hours to get there, even though it's only 2 miles away, because I'm going to have to go all over the place so they don't follow. That sort of thing. Seeing James Bond do that would be amazing. It would be terrible cinema, but it would be absolutely hysterical from an intel perspective that he was finally acting like an intelligence agent. So yeah, those are the sorts of things. It's both. How do I put this? If you've seen the movie Spy with Melissa McCarthy, it came out about 10-15 years ago or so, and there's a line in there where they're at the CIA, and the agents are around a table, and the woman who's playing like the M-like character, she's giving them the lowdown. And one of them says some really off-colored sort of comment, and she's like, "Excuse me, you're not immune from the HR department." Like that is so true. Like people don't understand the power that HR has in the intel world. I mean, it's the same in the regular world, but you wouldn't imagine that the intelligence community, number one, has an HR department, let alone has one that's can crack the whip. So yeah, it's bureaucracy at its finest.
I can certainly believe anything connected with the American government is going to have a great
Right.
deal of paperwork involved with it. You mentioned that you wrote your thesis on philosophical anthropology. I wonder if any of your thoughts on that, on human nature and on the, sort of the nature both of the people doing the work and making the decisions, and also the people sort of opposite the chessboard, or the people being acted upon or observed. Has any of that come into play in any of the working or thinking you've done?
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense of the way that I looked at philosophical anthropology was very much related to psychology. And so I'm a big fan of Dr. Jordan Peterson, for example. So obviously he's looking at it from more the psychological perspective versus philosophical anthropology is looking at it from like what is human nature itself. So there's obviously going to be some crossover there. And I think Dr. Peterson is able to articulate the psychological aspect of it very well. I mean, that's why I think he's been as popular as he's been. In terms of my work that I've done, when I go on like Fox News or something like that, and I talk about most recently I was on a couple of weeks ago for the death of the Iranian president, and they were asking, are the people going to rise up and rebel over this? Are they going to overthrow their government? And I'm like, when it comes to human nature, it's possible in the sense of, and I told them, I'm like, over the next 72 hours, I'm going to look to see if it's going to happen. If it doesn't happen in 72 hours, this is not going to be the catalyst for it, just because human nature itself can be very emotive for various different reasons. And that was kind of where the discussion centered around. And that really kind of came back to, philosophical anthropology. What is it that drives the human will? And all the aspects surrounding that. I had a couple different courses on Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, which he deals with that specifically in Prima Secundae a lot. I think to a certain extent in Secundae as well. And I mean, I love Thomas Aquinas. Summa Contra Gentiles is my book more than anything when it comes to St. Thomas. So that's probably the area that philosophical anthropology really kind of plays in my own life, and being able to take that not only to a viewership of however many million when I'm on Fox, but also when I was in the intel world, and being able to I remember having discussions with my bosses about certain different courses of action in terms of what we would have to do to get information about very different people and different countries. And the thing that I always wanted to talk, they were always interested in like more the technical aspect of it. Okay, here's where we're going to have to do, here's how we're technically going to collect it. And I was looking at it more from the what in military terms they would call it the intangibles, how the moral, the philosophical, the things that you can't measure, in terms of like what drives the human will. You can't really measure that. You can try to slap a number on it, but it's not, it's never going to be a perfect sort of thing. It's going to be certainly to a certain extent, a bit arbitrary more than anything. Um, but anyways, so I would always come at it from, okay, what background is that person coming from? The person that we need to get this information from, are they, what is their cultural background? Various different cultures have various different reactions to things. So, for example, the Chinese um, are very reticent to ever admit that they're wrong. They always will. You could show them that they, didn't sign their name on a piece of paper, and they will say, or they did sign their name on a piece of paper, and they'll say, "Nope, that's not me." Like, you can show them all the evidence they want, and they will not, adhere, or they will not agree to it, because in that culture, it is a sign of, to a certain extent, weakness, but it's a faux pas more than anything to admit that you're wrong.
Yeah.
So those cultural sorts of things need to be taken into account, and that, all goes back to how is the person made up? What is human nature itself? So that's a long-winded answer to that question.
I've been trying to think of a way to ask this next question without sort of inviting you to burn down all of your uh, all of your contacts in your career. But I'll just make an observation that, in this an election year, there's sure to be talk about the deep state and about intelligence agencies with the kind of tentacles out into everybody's electronic communications, scooping up all the data, right? We see and hear everything, and we're watching you. But let me ask it this way: what sort of attitude do you think people, Americans, ought to take towards their government's intelligence agencies? Should they be confident? Should they be worried? I'm trying not to ask anything too specific or to pin you down on any
No, you're totally
particular.
fine. I will say that I really like not being in prison, so I will refrain from telling you any classified information. So sorry for
Thank you.
your listeners. I really don't like the idea of going to prison. So, anyways, having said that, I will say that I have witnessed flashes of what we could call the deep state. And I had conversations about this on the campaign trail, and the probably most articulate way of phrasing it is that, at least in conservative circles, the sort of general consensus, or the main way of talking about it is, it's almost as if there's, like, this mustache twirling villain behind the scenes, pulling the strings of all that's going on. And if we just, take care of that, then everything will go back to normal and everything will be fine. That's not true. There is no single or even a small cabal of mustache twirling villains. There's no head that you can cut off, and everything will be fine. It's more cultural there than anything. And the reason I say that is because most of the people I worked with, wonderful people, sort of the standard sort of response, from anyone in that sort of line of work. And it's true. The people that I worked with, I really enjoyed. There were always, some people that you just, number one, either didn't like or wanted to stay away from, just because they had some sort of axe to grind, and they were smart enough to know how to play the game. And by that, I mean someone, for example, who is pushing the envelope of what would be acceptable intelligence analysis in terms of how much political input they put into it. They will push the envelope for that. And if they have a boss who is of their similar philosophical mindset, then the boss will push it through. And so if you get enough of those people in the right places, then they'll push it through, and it won't be as sanitized of personal feelings as it should have been. And so the way that I saw it fixed was, when I was stationed over with European Command. I had a wonderful commanding officer who, as soon as he saw a flash of that going on, he said, "Cut the crap. You guys are here to provide your best analysis. I don't want to hear what your personal philosophy is about what's, right or wrong or anything like that. Give me what you think is happening in the most unbiased way possible." And from what I saw, that's what did it. It just required people who were willing to push back against them and say, "Cut the crap, do your job." And the sad thing is, you can't legislate that. You can't tell people this is how you're going to get promoted if you do X, Y, or Z. That you can't. There's no way. Once again, that goes towards an intangible. Like, how do you measure that? And if you do try to start measuring that, then people are just going to work that into the system just to game the system. So it's one of those things. It's cultural more than anything.
It sounds not too terribly different from other workplaces and the tension between the professionalism and pursuing private agendas. And of course, what makes all the difference is who's the boss, and how much does the boss insist upon, the professional conduct, etc.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's probably one of the fun things to see when I describe Intel work to the general population or those who are not usually familiar with it, is how similar it is to the rest of everyone else's life. I say that I'm incredibly grateful for the career that I've had in the Intel world. I loved it. I had a great time with it. I will say, there were some days where I was sitting at my computer, sitting at my desk. I'm like, wow, this is so boring. And then there are other days where I'm like, I would read, some really, really saucy stuff, and I'm like, yes, this is exactly why I took this job. This is so cool. So I mean, you get those sorts of days anywhere. I mean, mine just happened to be for really classified stuff where, my country would imprison me if I ever disclosed it. So other than that, it was great.
That's great. That sounds like a really remarkable look into a rather unique career, one that not many people follow. Let me ask you the question of the show, which is, what kind of advice would you have for somebody, say a sophomore in college, who's considering whether to pick up a philosophy double major, or is just considering taking a few more classes in philosophy more than are required? Anything from your perspective on life, personally and professionally, that might help them make a decision in that situation?
So I will split this into personal and then professional sort of advice. Personally, short answer, do it, 100%. Personally, this has been the most value. Doing a master's in maps, doing or studying philosophy in general, was probably the most valuable thing I've ever done. It is by far the most useless thing I've done, and I've mentioned this to you before, in terms of it didn't teach me how to build a table, it didn't teach me how to make money, but from who I am as a person and the confidence that I got intellectually to tackle really hard problems and to just put myself out there, try new things, whatever. I mean, it has been incredibly valuable, invaluable, if you will. Just because someone doesn't earn a paycheck from something doesn't mean that what one does isn't valuable. From a professional standpoint, uh, if an undergrad is thinking about taking this as a double major, make sure the other major is going to be something that you can make money off of. Because if you get a standalone philosophy bachelor's alone, you're at the mercy of the workforce and whatever is available at the time, because you got to make money, unfortunately. And I've been on the end where I'm looking for jobs and such on Indeed, on LinkedIn, and all that sort of stuff. Very few of them have philosophy bachelors as requirements. So from a professional standpoint, make sure you're covering your bases so that you can live. But from a personal standpoint, and by extension, professional, it will pay dividends in the long run based off of who you are as a person more than anything.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Matthew. My guest today has been Matthew Shoemaker, an intelligence officer, nuclear war strategist, and a former congressional candidate. Thanks again for being on the program, Matthew.
Professor, it's been an absolute delight. Thank you very much for having me on.
Thank you for listening to Life After Philosophy. If you enjoyed the podcast, please rate it 5 stars and share this episode with a friend. I appreciate your support.